Hey, Fred, welcome to the Single Track Podcast.
Well, thank you, Finn. How are you?
I'm doing great. And I think that if we're able to retain the level of discourse that we had before I hit record here, it's going to be one hell of an episode.
Oh, come on now. I'm just a quiet fellow. Anyway, go shoot away.
I think just to get the table set here for any folks that are not familiar with you and your background, we should do maybe 1 to 2 minutes on who you are and how you're involved in the sport, and maybe a quick overview of this blueprint for sponsorship and ultra running that I think will be the focus of the conversation. So take it away.
Well, a little bit of my background. I'm probably the only person you're ever going to meet who ran the first 2 New York City marathons through the 5 boroughs. So I have been running for, I guess we're talking about almost 35 years. Well, 45 years. 45 years. And so I've watched our sport change from originally, I started as a road runner, obviously. So I've watched the parallels between what's happened in road racing and what's happened in trail running. And the parallels to me are quite amazing. I ran my first ultra back in 1995, maybe 1996. I ran Leadville. Back in those days, you sent in a stamped envelope to Ken Klauber, and then you got noticed that you were going to run. And so I've watched the sport change, and really, it's been an incredible change.
And you're the race director for the Run Rabbit Run as well.
Run Rabbit Run. This year will be our 16th year of our 50 miler, our 11th year of our 100 miler. It takes place in Steamboat Springs. You probably know we offer the highest purse money in our 100 miler of any ultra trail run in the world. We've done our best to try to capture both keeping what's good of, the traditions of the sport back when I was running Leadville, the intimacy of the sport, at the same time as acknowledging that the sport is really changing and we need to grow with it.
One other thing that I want to set the table for is this, I don't know if you want to call it a manifesto, but it was an interesting sort of call to arms for the ultra community around sponsorship. And anytime I see these floating around the internet, I get super excited. So I think it was Brian Meltzer wrote an article in Trail Runner magazine about just the current state of sponsorship in our sport. He linked to your blueprint, and that's how I came across it. And so yeah, talk a bit about that as well. And I think first, what inspired you to write it and what the conditions were that just caused you to put that out into the world?
Well, that blueprint was written a number of years ago, and I talked to Brian about it several years ago. I didn't talk to him, interestingly enough, before he put that thing in Trail Runner magazine. The thrust of it is, look, our sport is growing. Whether we like it or not, it's growing. And what happens when a sport grows like this is that there's money in it. And whether or not we're in favor of that doesn't really matter. The sport is growing. And it seems to me that right now everybody kind of wants to make money off of the sport, whether it's the sponsors or the race directors. Everybody's kind of making money off the sport, except for the runners. And it just seemed to me that was not right. And Steamboat Springs, where Run Rabbit Run is located, is kind of well known for producing more Olympic athletes than any other town in America. And it just seemed like the perfect place to bring high quality runners to, and to offer prize money. And I think when you offer prize money, you get more competition, and you get more competition, you get more interest in the sport. And that will benefit everybody, the sponsors as well as the runners.
A couple questions on that. The first, you mentioned Run Rabbit Run has now been around for 16 years. And without a doubt, Run Rabbit has been one of the most progressive races out there when it comes to putting the athletes first and putting a substantial amount of prize money up for the top runners to take home. Do you think that the model you have set up at this race for the top athletes has proven out your thesis in this blueprint, where if you put all those conditions together, sort of if you build it, they will come, all of this will come to fruition? Or have you been surprised about other races like UTMB and anything else that happens concurrently at that time of year, September?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting way to put the question. I mean, I don't think having a race like ours is the magic bullet that is going to suddenly create a lot of interest in the sport. But let me give you a little anecdote. I mean, I don't know if you've seen this. There's a YouTube video called REI Presents How to Run 100 Miles. Have you ever seen that?
Yes.
It's got 5.5 million views. Those guys appeared at Run Rabbit Run. They didn't tell us they were coming. REI, we're not sponsored by REI. In fact, my request to them to sponsor us after that basically went ignored. But the point is that there are 5.5 million people, very few of whom have anything to do with ultra running, who watch that sport. And our sport is so parochial, we don't recognize really how extraordinary it is what people are doing when they're going out there and running 100 miles. That's an extraordinary thing. And when that YouTube video came out, all of these people who are probably sports fans in some way saw that thing. And you can read from the comments, they're going, oh my God, people are running 100 miles. It's an extraordinary thing. And we're not really taking advantage of that to market our sports to the public. And neither are our sponsors. They're not taking advantage of that.
Why don't you think they are taking advantage of that?
Well, a lot of the sponsors are, their audience and their potential customers are trail running shoes, trail running, headlamps, socks. If you look at the really big events in the sporting world, in running, particularly in running, look at the New York City Marathon. Its presenting sponsor is Tata Consulting Services. Yeah, I mean, they have very little to do with running, but they recognize that most runners and most athletes, they buy insurance, they bank, they have financial advisors. We haven't yet penetrated that market of sponsors who are willing to throw the kind of money into our events to generate that kind of publicity.
And what you're suggesting is that in order to get those types of, and we've used the term non-endemic sponsors in our community, we have to start relying even more on this story of just the pure physical courage and amazement that's involved in simply completing 100 miles, regardless of whether you are Jim Walmsley and Courtney Dauwalter, or you're the person that finished, DFL at Run Rabbit Run last year.
Yeah, and let me tell you how I got into ultra running. I was a road racer. I think these days most of the people getting into ultra and trail running are road racers. I was in my 40s. I wasn't, my days of running sub 250 marathons were behind me. And I watched on TV the wide world of sports. You're probably too young to even know what that is.
Jim McKay.
Yeah, Jim McKay, Wide World of Sports. And I believe it was in 1995. They had devoted an entire episode to the 1995 Leadville 100. It was the race where Ann Trayson was running against the Tarahumaras. It was narrated by Frank Shorter. It was 1 hour of absolutely riveting television. I mean, you not only saw, Ann Trayson and the Tarahumaras duke it out, but you had the story of the woman who was a cancer survivor, who was running our first 100-miler. It was absolutely riveting. And I happened then to have, at the very same time, have a friend who had run Leadville that year. And I think that was the 1995 Leadville. And he had run Leadville. And he asked me, do you want to come out and crew for me next year? I said, sure. And I went out there and I watched it, and I thought it was one of the most extraordinary things I had ever seen. And I was, how hard can it be? People are doing this. But back then, the number of people who were doing those 100-milers was tiny. But we haven't really captured that kind of the wide world of sports. We haven't really been able to do anything like that where we've been able to promote our sport to the wider audience.
That Ann Trayson video, I have not seen it before. Hopefully I can find it on YouTube and we can include it in the show notes at some point.
I have actually contacted Ann and asked her, do you have a copy of that? You know, it was ABC Wide World. Do you have a copy of that? She didn't. There are versions floating around, but they're really not quite the same ones. If you get it, I'd love to see it.
Yeah.
If we could get sponsors to put together an hour video like that, I mean, it would be extraordinary, and we would be attracting we'd be, introducing the sport to the millions of people who are sports junkies.
Well, one word on Jim McKay before we move on. It would be great to have someone like him in the sport because he had such a natural ability to tell the story behind all of these athletes. Like I remember there was like a diving video that I watched where they were talking about, those massive, like 180-foot jumps that these divers would do into the pools. And I could care nothing about that sport, but he was able to talk about how, X diver made all these sacrifices to get there. And here's the 9-to-5 job they worked. And here's how he grew up and all this kind of stuff. And he was just the best sort of painter of picture with words and emotions. And the story that he made you feel the athlete is the best way I could put it.
Right. And he said that if he could get somebody interested in the athletes as a human being, he could sell any sport to anyone. And he did a great job of doing that. And I think we're trying to do that. And he was able to combine not just doing that, not just doing the mom and pop running their, diving, but also the highly competitive ones and make the competition interesting. We don't have anybody in our sport right now that does that. Maybe you'll do it. I have a lot to learn from a storytelling standpoint. I'm more of just a pundit, but I will say this, in the blueprint that you wrote, you talk about these concentric circles and that for the majority of our sports existence, we have catered from a marketing standpoint almost exclusively to the diehards. And yet there's these other two rings. Right after the diehards are the runners themselves that just, they participate, but they're not like tuned in to the who's who type stuff. Then you have runners that aren't ultra runners, but they're in the running community. And then beyond that, you have the general population. And the question that I want to ask off of this is, when you think about growing the sport, is there a difference when it comes to attracting not necessarily a new participant in the sport, but a new fan? Like, is there a different approach there? Because and the reason I ask this question, and I'm sorry to be long-winded, is there's a guy who's trying to grow the sport of lacrosse right now. His name is Paul Rabel, and he talks about how when this former league, the Major League Lacrosse, was trying to take off, their thesis was that they had to grow the grassroots participation of the sport, and there would be a trickle-up effect. And they found that ultimately failed. And instead, with this new league, they focused more on creating an entertainment product and focusing on people that wouldn't necessarily participate in the sport, but they were just general sports fans that could latch on and watch and be satisfied, and they would grow that way. So curious what your thoughts are in terms of distinguishing those two. Yeah, it's funny, when you started that story, my initial reaction was, boy, I don't agree with that. Yeah, I mean, look, there are millions and millions of Americans who consider themselves runners. I mean, we all know that, there's got to be 10 million Americans whose lifestyle is based in large measure around running. Not all those people are going to become trail runners. Not all those people are going to become, ultra runners. Mm. And there's probably a limitation to how many of them are going to become ultra runners. I mean, there's only so many races that you could put on and so many national forests and all that. But who are the heroes right now that those runners have? They don't have any heroes. They don't have people that they can follow in the running world. Track and field is endlessly scandalized by drug use. Much of the trail running races are dominated by foreign athletes who most Americans can't remember their names, the Kenyans and the Ethiopians. There is just a vacuum of lack of heroes that American runners can follow. And that presents a tremendous opportunity. I mean, I say this all the time. 3 million people watch poker on TV. Now, I don't watch poker on TV, but those are the people who they're watching it because of the competition. They enjoy watching the competition. I think 2.5 million people watch bull riding on TV.
Let me ask you this. What are your qualifications for what it means to be a hero in sports? Because I think this is an interesting topic here where you're suggesting a lack of heroes in the running world is one of the reasons why either the growth has been stunted or something to that effect. So when you think about a hero in sports, who comes to mind? And then how does ultrarunning fill the gap there?
Well, I mean, we have a sport that's full of attractive guys. They're attractive men and women who are in incredible physical shape. Most of them are pretty well spoken. They don't cheat. Some of them are pretty cool. Some of them are pretty. They're almost all articulate. Anytime you see somebody like Courtney Dauwalter, I mean, there's no reason that Courtney Dauwalter, shouldn't be a nationally famous person. It seems to me pretty obvious that those people can be heroes particularly to girls. I mean,
she's transcended, right? She's transcended the sport. She's been on Joe Rogan, and I think when people make associations with ultrarunning, she might be one of the first people that comes to mind.
I think it's not just one of the first; she's one of the few. I mean,
one of the few, yeah.
One of the few. I mean, there's probably 2 or 3 names that come to mind when the average person thinks of ultra runners. It's probably Courtney, and maybe it's Walmsley, and of course it's Killian. But let me give you a little anecdote about how difficult it is for us. All right, so our race, and I don't want to sit there and toot the horn for Run Rabbit Run, okay? But we have a very competitive field, as you probably know. And so I've done a little experiment for the past 10 years. And the experiment is this. We offer $500 to any person who's in our race, and we've got like 600 entrants in the race. $500 to anyone that can pick the male winner in the 100-miler, the female winner in the 100-miler, and the male winner in the 50, and the female winner in the 50-miler. And not only that, but we have a handicapping page where we list all of the contenders, right? And all you got to do is submit 4 names, and be eligible to win $500. Of the 600 runners who enter our race, how many people do you think actually bother to look at the entry field and just pick 4 names out of a hat for the opportunity to win $500? How many would you guess?
I am going to guess that it's under 50 because I didn't even know this was a thing, and I'm fascinated.
The answer is it almost always is about a dozen people.
Wow.
Only a dozen people out of 500 ultra runners care enough to look at the entrant list and pick 4 names. I mean,
I think that's going to change. I mean, that's wild to me. I think that's going to change big time this year because I can assure you that we'll talk about it on this podcast. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with the whole fantasy ultra running setup that Free Trail has created online to allow for sort of a pick'em style thing in races. So I think that could change.
Yeah, well, we've never given away the $500. Right? In fact, the only person who's come close to actually guessing all four is me. I got 3 out of 4 once. But I mean, it just says something. We're not just not doing a very good job of marketing our sports to the broader sports community, to the people who follow athletics in general. We're not even marketing the sport to the diehard ultra runner. I bet if you asked 100 people, 100 ultra runners, I should say, I bet if you asked 100 ultra runners, name 3 out of the top 5 finishers of UTMB last year, they couldn't do it.
I think I would agree with that.
I mean, they're not following the sport. And they're certainly not following the European sport. Just, now this is bad, but it's also good because it does really present an opportunity for sponsors and for people who are trying to promote the sport like yourself. There's an incredible vacuum.
Do you think that there are already sort of easily replicable models out there where a commentator like myself could go and look and say, oh, there's how they did it in swimming, or there's how they did it in cycling, or there's how they did it in basketball, and easily just like pick and pull from that and apply it to the sport, and it would be like a ready-made solution? Or is it more complex than that?
I think it's complex, but I think one thing that all of these sports, whether or not it's, professional rodeo or poker or cycling for that matter, is they have a national organization that works together to promote the sport. And they have a method for how to do it. We don't have that.
Yep.
There's no centralized organization that's really doing a good job of promoting. I don't think any one race, whether it's us or Western states or anyone else, can do it on their own. And right now there's really a reluctance for a lot of these races to work together. There's even just disagreement on the basic question of, do we award prize money? People don't even want to do that. Somehow or other they think that that's a bad thing, to reward, our athletes who are training their tails off, to give them money for it.
Okay, so a couple things there. First, you're suggesting that above all else, the first thing we would need to do in this quote unquote perfect world is to centralize and consolidate leadership so that there's a unified game plan for all this and it could be disseminated easily?
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's the first thing, but I think that that's probably essential. There has to be at least some kind of a coordinated effort between like-minded individuals and like-minded, athletes and race directors and sponsors, that, to promote the sport that way.
Yep. Because
right now, look, I mean, we're a charity race, Run Rabbit. We can't put together a couple of $100,000 or whatever it costs to create a video like the one on Wide World of Sports. We can't do that. But if you get together a bunch of sponsors and a bunch of like-minded race directors, maybe you can do it.
How is the prize money financed at Run Rabbit?
All of our money comes from our sponsors and from entry fees.
Interesting.
And which, I mean, if you think about it, maybe explains to you why there's so many people trying to put on races. There's money to be made. I mean, that's.
Well, and without knowing all the economics of the situation, I have to imagine that there are at least a few races here in the U.S. and definitely more abroad that have a similar stature to Run Rabbit Run in terms of sponsorship deals, registrations, etc. And yet your race is unique in that, it stands alone in offering the amount of prize money it does. So what gives there? Why are you on a relative island?
And I don't know if we're on a relative island. The other thing is, not only are we, awarding like $75,000 in prize money, but we give about $40,000 a year away in charity. I mean, now part of it is, look,
where's the money going in other races, do you think?
You tell me, where do you think it's going? Where do you think UTMB's money is going?
Well, not even UTMB. I mean, and by the way, UTMB is obviously the easy one to pick on,
Right.
but there are a lot of other races that are even independent races that I have to imagine have the same sort of stature that Run Rabbit Run does. And what decisions are they making to forego that amount of prize money for their top athletes?
Well, look, I'm not against race directors and races making money. I think that's
Neither am I. I fully support it.
Thing. I mean, actually, I'd rather have people who love the sport and care about the sport,
Me too.
make money out of it and do a good event. I think the weakness that's happening, and what could be the Achilles heel in our sport is that it's relying on free labor. I mean, it's relying on volunteers.
Yeah.
And I've heard increasingly more and more volunteers going, hey, wait a minute, why am I volunteering at your race so that you can make money? We don't have that problem at Run Rabbit Run because everyone knows they're and again, I don't want to toot the horn of our race, but I think we have the best volunteers of any race I've ever been to, and I've been to an awful lot of ultras. And I think that's because the volunteers realize that the money isn't going into our pockets, it's going to charities, and it's going to promote the sport. And I think other races are going to have that problem. Is more and more. I've heard more and more stories of people putting on races and volunteers don't show up, and they've had to reorganize aid stations. And I think that's the Achilles heel in it right now.
I'm sure there are multiple race directors listening to our conversation now that are saying, well, listen, if I went and increased my staff, to work this event, I would have to shut down,
sure,
X number of races in an instant because I can't take those costs on. Like the math just doesn't work.
Exactly.
But at the same time, I also recognize that, it is an awkward situation where people are volunteering at a for-profit event. So do you have any thoughts on how to reconcile that situation?
Well, I know that what race directors are trying to do is they're giving free entries to the following year's race, or they're giving them discounts. Well, once you're doing those kinds of incentives, those people aren't volunteers anymore, right?
Yeah.
By definition, they're not volunteers if you're compensating them in some way. And I think that that's going to be the future. Now you've got a lot of races, they're giving back to the community in different ways. And so you get people to volunteer because they realize that the races are giving back to the community, and then that's a good thing. But I think I'm not sure what the solution is, although it would seem to me that if those race directors have a forward-looking view, that they would realize that the solution is really promoting our sport, more and more, and because that will cause the sport to grow, and that will benefit them in the long run. I mean, ultra running is a big tent. I mean, you can have the UTMBs, and you can have the little mom and pop races, and you can have the Leadvilles and the Western States, and you can have all of those things. It's a big tent. There's not many people in the tent, but it's a big tent, So I'm not sure I answered your question, but
no, that was pretty good. I think what I want to bring it back to ultimately is something you said earlier about how when you think about the growth of the sport and the increasing commercialization of it, professionalization of it, et cetera, in your view, almost all of the earnings from that have gone to everybody except the runner. So I guess my first question there is, who is it going to?
What are you talking about, the entry fees and things like that? Or I'm not sure what you're really asking.
I think I'm asking about just all of the money. Like if you pick any source of money in the sport, whether it's brands that are deciding to come in, large corporations, et cetera, we're seeing a lot of growth in the sport. But you said earlier that little to none of it is going to the top athletes in the sport, the quote unquote heroes of the sport, the people that we follow, et cetera. So I have a lot of questions off that, but the first one is, where is it mostly going at this point?
Well, I mean, there's obviously a cost to putting on a race. I mean, you've got to provide aid stations, and you've got to provide certain levels of safety, and you've got licensing and permitting issues. But other than that, I mean, the money that's coming in from either sponsors or from entry fees it's going into the race, to the organizers of the race, and that's perfectly okay. I mean, like I said, I think it's a good thing that people are able to, make money by putting on these races, because most of the people that are putting on these races love the sport,
yes,
and care about it. And I'd rather have them do it than have some corporate entity who couldn't care less about the sport try to profit off of it. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's a good thing. Whether or not those smaller races can survive in the face of, confronting the fact that maybe getting volunteers is harder. There's only so many volunteer hours that you can get. And before people go, I've been volunteering at an ultra race every weekend. I don't want to do it anymore. I don't know what you probably know more than I do about, how that's playing out.
Yeah. I think the other thing I want to ask in this realm is, what inspired you to take such an active role in supporting athletes? Run Rabbit Run has one of the largest prize purses out there. Talk about the decision to make that such a focal point of the race.
Well, we started off as a 50 miler, just regular old 50 miler in Steamboat Springs. The idea was to attract good athletes at Steamboat Springs. We didn't have a purse, and we still don't have a purse for our 50 miler. And then what inspired me is, I went and ran Leadville one year. Full disclosure, I'm a 10-time Leadville finisher, and I love Leadville and all that. But I went out there, I think it was the year that Lifetime Fitness had taken it over. And I can't remember what year that was. It was probably 15 years ago, something like that. And it was really poorly organized. I mean, they ran, and at that point I was already becoming a back of the packer. I was like probably 60 years old, and they ran out of water, and there were lines to get, your fuel. And when I got to the Tabajo Pass, they had run out of everything. And I had said to myself, is this really the best that Colorado can do in terms of putting on a 100-mile race? I mean, that and Leadville, at that time, I think were the only 100-mile races. And I was pretty good friends with some folks that used to be elite road racers. And I knew about the history of road racing. And I knew how back in the early 80s, before the early 80s, there was no purse money in road racing. Prize money was paid under the table. I think it was 1981 that they started, the Cascade Runoff with Prefontaine and John Sinclair and Herb Lindsay and Bill Rogers, and they just openly accepted money. And I realized that, that trail running is going in the same direction kind of as road racing. And so I organized a meeting over at Nick Clark's house. Nick Clark at that time, now he puts on NAR runners, and Clark at that time was one of the best ultra runners around. And it was Nick Clark and Geoff Roes and Carl Meltzer. And I said, I want to put on a race that's going to have prize money. How do we do it? And we sat and just, hammered it out. And this is what we came up with. And I think it was Geoff Roes, who at that time, I think was the best ultra runner in the world.
Yep.
Geoff Roes had this great idea, which I thank him for. He said, what would be really neat, Fred? He said, the problem with most of these races is the gun goes off and the top runners take off and no one ever sees them again. Unless it's an out and back course, they kind of wave them as they go by. He said, why don't you start the non-elites a lot earlier? And that's what we do in Run Rabbit Run. We start the non-elites at 8:00 in the morning. We call them the tortoises. We start the elites at noon. We call them hares. I can't tell you how many people have come up to me and said, man, I saw what's his name at mile 70. He was puking just like I was. I saw him put this move to take the lead. And I think, and so
It's a great idea.
Yeah, it was cool. It's cool. And thanks, Geoff, if you're listening.
Great blog, by the way. He's got a great blog. He's an ideas man.
He's a good man, and he makes great coffee. I don't know if you know that he roasts coffee.
I have been dying, by the way, to get him on the podcast to do a sort of Where Are They Now ultra running type episode, Heroes from the Past.
I will do everything I can to get Geoff to do it for you. I still buy coffee from him every month.
Where is he right now? Like, what's his situation?
Juneau,
okay.
Alaska.
He's in Juneau. Okay.
He suffered some. I mean, look, this is a tough sport. I used to tell Geoff, and at that time he had just won our 50 miler, and that's one of the reasons he was interested in doing the 100 miler in Run Rabbit Run. He had just won our 50, and these guys would race every 3 or 4 weeks, right? I mean, and I remember telling Geoff, I said, you got marathoners who are out there running for purses of $250,000. If they did what you guys did, they'd be burned out in 2 years. I mean, their bodies can't take that kind of, and I think that's what happened to him. He just got burned. His body got burned out, which is another reason why we should be supporting, helping these athletes and not forcing them to be dirtbaggers and living out of their cars and.
This reminds me, and I've talked about this. It must have been 5 or 6 months ago, but one of the things that they do in other sports well that I think we don't quite do in our sport is they are very ceremonial in other sports about when an athlete's career is ending. So, for example, I watched the show Hard Knocks, which profiles, an NFL team for, in preseason or for a 6 to 8 week stretch during the year. And the latest one is with the Arizona Cardinals. And they devote an entire episode to JJ Watt, who's this all-world defensive end, and it's his retirement season, and he's about to fade off into the sunset, and they make a whole episode out of it. And I think that's so cool. And one of the sad things about our sport, in my opinion, is a lot of top athletes, they either drop off the face of the earth or there's no sort of announcement or distinguishing of when their professional career is over and when they've just become, I'll use the term, just pure participant. And I think that's another interesting thing that we could add. I've always wanted to see it, but I think Geoff is a good example of, he kind of just dropped off and I think the overtraining story has been told, but there wasn't really much of a ceremony around it, which I think is tough.
It is sad. And it's not just Geoff. Did anybody really have the celebration of Ann Trayson?
Right.
Probably the greatest woman ultra runner in history no. And again, it goes down to the fact that our sport is so parochial and fragmented. We don't have a national organization. We don't have a national focus. And, you asked me earlier about how whether or not Run Rabbit Run and its prize money is, am I satisfied with how it's gone? And the answer is, look, we always want to have a better field.
Yeah.
And what happens is people come and they win our race or they run well and they suddenly get noticed by sponsors. And a lot of them go and run UTMB, right? And I get it, because when they go and run UTMB, they are treated like celebrities. The press is interviewing them. They're featured in the newspapers. Why? Because there's a huge, it's a big sport in Europe. We can do the same thing here, but not as individual races promoting themselves, but as an organization of races promoting the sport.
I think that's a pretty profound statement. And you must have a decent pulse on the state of race directing in the sport. You must be in conversation with fellow race directors across the country. Are we anywhere close to an appetite for that, where we do work together and it's not everybody for themselves?
Well, I don't know. Look, I'm not in contact with that many race directors. I used to be on the Hard Rock board until recently, so I do know the folks at Hard Rock. I'm good friends with Nick Clark, and he puts on those NAR runner races. They're They're great races. Of course, Carl Melcher and I are pretty good friends, and but is there an appetite for it? I think there is an appetite for it. What there isn't is someone who's really going to grab the bulls by the horn and say, let's do it. Because it's not easy. I was contacted a while back, a couple of years ago. I'm not going to mention names, but by a very good runner who said that he had been in contact with a whole bunch of the elite runners. And what they felt was the impediment to supporting prize money in racing was the fear of drug, that it would invite, which I happen to think is a boogaboo, but okay. And what he wanted to do, he said, if you do this, if you use, instead of offering prize money, I will have everybody come and run Rabbit Run, and you will use the prize money for drug testing. I said, I'm all in. Whatever you guys want to do. And he tried to organize create an organization of trail runners who would do it. And he gave up. Sad, but he gave up. But there is an appetite of some people to do that. And your podcast is as good as anything else.
Do you think, has your worldview around the influence of prize money been confirmed or changed over the years in terms of the incentives and the carrots that it puts in front of runners? Like, I guess what I'm trying to ask is, like, you put together this massive prize purse for Run Rabbit Run. Has it attracted the depth of competition that you thought it would attract? Has it done less or more? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I mean, I think we're probably, unquestionably, other than maybe Western States, the most competitive 100-mile race, in North America. Again, would we like to have a better field every year? Yeah, we'd always like that. I'd like to have our fields full with the 10 fastest ultra runners, men and women, every year, but that isn't going to happen. But it's been getting better every year. I'm not sure that's answering your question.
Well, I think one of the reasons why I asked it is because, we have this specter of UTMB, and you talked about one of the advantages they have is they do have the ability to work in concert with other races and funnel top athletes to their starting lines. And I think the overarching question that I really want to ask you here is, do you think it's a good or a bad thing that so many elite athletes in both the women's and the men's fields spend increasingly larger amounts of time over in Europe pursuing the sport and, racing the best races in the prime of their career? Like, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Like, is that a good thing or a bad thing in your opinion for American ultra running?
I don't think it's a question whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's an inevitable thing, as long as those people can go there and be treated like the celebrities that they are. And look, I think UTMB now offers some prize money, but yes, for a long time, you'd go over there and you'd win a race and you get a cowbell. But you're running, through towns where, first of all, you're running with 10,000 other people in some of these races. You're running through towns where the town comes out and greets you en masse, where the level of interest in the sport is so high that it's its own reward. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I would hope that American ultra runners see the benefit in running in America and promoting the sport. But I also understand, they got a short shelf life. Right. There's the Carl Melchers who can run for 10 or 15 years and a few others. But by and large, the shelf life is 3 to 4 years, and you got to maximize and enjoy it as much as you can. I would hope, though, that some of those runners, when, whether or not they get to send away retirement party in the video or about their careers or not, that they would stay in the sport and promote American running. I would hope they would do that. And I don't know how many do. So
you don't necessarily, and this is, I'm offering a hypothetical here. I don't necessarily buy it myself, but you're not saying that because they're over there in Europe spending so much of their season, like for example, Jim Walmsley is, that it's harder to root for them because they're just not, they're in the moment with other runners at Run Rabbit Run. They're choosing to be at UTMB instead. That doesn't make it harder to root for them or to be in touch with them.
I don't know about, I'm not sure what you mean by rooting for them. I mean, obviously I'm rooting.
Following.
Yeah. The American running community does not follow or care very much about what is happening in Europe. And if the goal is to promote American ultra running in America, then those guys going there are not doing that, except for maybe the people who follow Walmsley or Courtney. But I also understand why they do that. I mean, they're treated like heroes over there. Mm. They're not treated like heroes here. And we can change that, but it's not going to happen overnight. There has to be a will to do it. Am I confusing you?
No, it's just a lot to think about. It's a lot to think about. And, I've trained myself to not feel the pressure to necessarily respond right in the moment. Sometimes I'll just stare at you for 5 seconds and think, chew on what I just heard. I'm trying to meditate on this. Okay. I know I've taken us all over the place. I apologize, but truly this is all fascinating to me. There was another thing you said in the blueprint, and you actually mentioned poker a minute ago, and we talked about how they have a national organization that, makes marketing and whatnot more effective. But what can we learn from these sports and activities like NASCAR, bull riding, and poker about how they attracted casual fans and followers? Because when I think about the rings that we talked about earlier with, regular runners, the rest of the running community, etc., I have to imagine that we don't have many casual followers for the sport that aren't actually like in the trenches running races themselves.
I don't think we have casual followers of the sport who are runners. I think that's the problem. Like I said, we got 12 people out of 500 who follow Run Rabbit Run. I mean, who presumably are running our race and know that we have an elite field, who know enough or care enough about the sport to go and look at the entry list and pick 4 random names and maybe get lucky to win $500. That's a weakness that, it isn't a matter of attracting those people, because poker doesn't attract that many poker players. It probably does. It probably attracts the casual poker, but, professional rodeo? I mean, I don't know how many professional rodeo people there are. I don't know how many professional race car drivers there are that, there aren't very many, but people follow NASCAR. I think we need to at least start attracting the runners, that 500 to 600,000 people who run marathons every year. Those people think of themselves as runners, and we need to start promoting our sport to those people, because I can tell you, I know a lot of those people, and it's anecdotal and, whatever it's worth. But when I tell, marathoners that I go and run 100-mile races, or I used to go and run 100-mile races, they look at me like I might as well have gone to the moon. Because what people in our sport are doing is an extraordinary thing. It's an incredible thing to go out and run 100 miles. And we're not selling the sport that way. And when they realize what an extraordinary thing it is, and then they see that there are people competing with each other at that level, there's just so much opportunity that we're not taking advantage of. I know you're asking me, well, how do we do it? And if I knew, I would do it. I don't know how to do it.
I think maybe
I can't do it alone.
This question might help. And, we can always, I love brainstorming, so maybe we can take some time to brainstorm. But when I do an inventory of the content that I notice in our sport, it's typically 3 buckets. The first bucket is training methodology and, how to put together a training block, how to execute a race, all that kind of stuff. The coaching bucket, that's one. Another bucket is, these podcasts, myself included, where we interview top athletes and we to talk about their races and the circuits they're on, all that kind of stuff. And then maybe the third bucket is the conversation that we are having right now, talking sort of metaphysically about the sport and all the problems and what we can do to fix them. If we were creating a bucket to engage ultra runners that aren't fans of the sport yet, is there any content that comes to mind that we should be producing?
Yeah, I mean, again, if you look at that REI Presents video with 5.5 million views, it did not highlight the competitive aspect of the sport, which is, you know, a weakness of it. And I understand why they did it. They don't want to promote, you know, sponsored runners that are not sponsored by REI, and they were very careful not to show any of our, you know, there were no La Sportiva signs or Honey Stinger. I mean, they made sure to do all that. But again, going back to the Jim McKay analogy, right?
Yep.
You can promote the sport by showing what are extraordinary achievements of endurance that anyone can do with enough will and, you know, and time. You know, not everybody can climb Mount Everest, for example. You know, it takes a lot of money. But running 100 milers, which is probably more difficult, or running a 50 miler, probably more difficult than climbing Everest, anyone with will can do it. And we're not promoting that aspect of it at all. You know, every year at Run Rabbit Run, I don't know if you've ever been there, but I mean, I give the same story every year. Every year I do it, and I ask myself, why the hell am I doing this? Right? I mean, this is stupid. I mean, I'm putting hundreds of hours in. I don't make any money doing this. All right, I do it for a charity. But I'll tell you one of the reasons that I do it. When I'm standing at that finish line and I watch some of those people finish, and they're crying and their families are crying, gets to me every time.
Yeah.
And we can promote that to the casual fan. If it's moving me,
yeah, and
I'm about as a benumbed person as you'll ever meet. I'm a lawyer, for God's sakes. If it's moving me, can you imagine what it would do to somebody watching it who has no other than a casual interest in sports to watch something like that?
Right.
And then see there's also a competition going on here.
I think you mentioned a couple great examples in this conversation. The first, the Ann Trayson feature, you know, the whole nature of what Jim McKay did at Worldwide of Sports, and then this REI film. I guess, and I apologize if I'm being redundant if I asked this earlier, but when you think about all of those things that have been effective in other sports, does this storytelling piece, just the extraordinary feats of endurance that are happening, do you think it has to happen in the context of pro ultra running, or do we need to just multiply the number of REI videos that you've cited?
I think we have to do both.
Okay.
I think we have to promote, and that's what Jim McKay did. I mean, that Wide World of Sports video, he had, you know, the cancer survivor who was running, and he also had, you know, showed the competition between Ann Trayson and the Tara Humaras. And you know, he had it narrated by Frank Shorter, you know, right after he won the gold medal in the Olympics. And I remember Frank Shorter standing somewhere at some point on the course, the Leadville course, and if I thought hard enough, I'd know exactly where it was. But he'd go, this is the 26.22 mile mark of this course. For me, that would be an entire race. But for the people doing this, why, they've just started. You know? And I remember watching and going, Jesus Christ, you know? Boy, if you could do that and just, and I realize most of what you're watching on TV, those are infomercials. But, you know, you're buying time on, and that's part of the problem. You know, you need to buy time on, you know, Netflix or whatever. But if you had if you showed that on TV, I think the potential for attracting those kinds of fans there's a huge opportunity here.
This is something I'm trying to understand still, because I think about this question a lot, and I think we're touching on it here. when I think of other sports, and a lot of these are very established sports like the four majors, hockey, baseball, basketball, football, it doesn't seem like their method of growing the fans of the sport or even the participants of the sport requires focusing on every single type of athlete in the sport. Like they're almost exclusively telling the pro sports narrative, and there's sort of a trickle down effect, and people are inspired that way. Are you suggesting here, and I think a lot of the people have said this, but are you suggesting here that ultra running is unique in the sense that the formula for fan growth and participant growth is telling that story across the spectrum of runners?
I think yes. If I'm understanding your question, yes. I mean, look, pro baseball, basketball, football, hockey, those sports have been around for the better part of a century. And you've got people who follow them. We don't have that right now. But you've got to get them intrigued. I mean, and you gave the example of watching, a wide world of sports with people doing cliff diving, right? I mean, obviously it wasn't followed up on, and I'm not saying that there would be a market for professional cliff diving, but I think that analogy is more appropriate. I mean, I remember I used to watch barrel racing on the wide world of sports, and you're too young to know that, but every week there'd be a barrel racing event. I mean, and basically what that is speed skaters would go and jump over barrels and see how many barrels they can jump over. And most of those guys were, just family guys. There was actually just an article in the New Yorker just recently, and it was about I think it was in New Yorker. It was about lumberjacks and lumberjacking, competition. We need stories like that, But we also have incredible athletes. The guys that are doing these 100-milers, the Walmsleys and the Courtneys, these are incredible athletes, and we need to promote them as such as well. And I know we're kind of repeating ourselves here. And
no, repetition is good. Repetition is how things change.
Well, yeah, and so I mean, I'm hoping at the end of this that I will get some emails or phone calls from some other race leaders going, hey, I'm kind of agreeing with what you say. What do we need to do? And let's start brainstorming. Just like I brainstormed with the Geoff Roes and the Carl Meltzers and the Nick Clarks, and I think maybe there were others I don't remember right now. But how do we get off the dime of at least putting some prize money into a race?
This has been an awesome conversation. There's a couple of things I want to touch on before we go, but as far as the blueprint is concerned, is there anything that we haven't addressed yet in the blueprint that we should talk about?
God, maybe I should have read it before we did. No, I think the gist of it is that, I think it was Tip O'Neill. I don't know. You're probably too young to remember.
Yeah, Speaker of the House, right?
And he used to say to reporters, the answer to all of your questions is the same answer: money, right? and I think the same is true here. We're not going to promote the sport without putting money into it. And the only way we're going to put money into it is to get sponsors to work together, race directors to work together, and runners to work together to create a product that, is attractive to the American people. And it doesn't necessarily mean, and it doesn't mean that we are going to damage or destroy or hurt the wonderful things about our sport. I mean, those are not the notion that those are inconsistent goals is wrong.
First of all, as a former resident of Massachusetts and political junkie, I am so glad that we had a Tip O'Neill reference 200 episodes into this podcast. That's awesome. But second, and probably more important for this audience, you talked about money there. And I think another interesting thread we can go down is just the level of pickiness, I would say, there is about growth in this sport and how we sort of have to have this picture perfect model. in order to, evolve into the 21st century. Do you have any thoughts there? Like, do you think that we need to be extra do you think that we're in this pivotal moment where we need to be extra careful about all these decisions, or can it be sort of laissez-faire and, money is not necessarily an evil thing, and it'll all work itself out?
Well, I mean, money is not necessarily an evil thing. Growth is not necessarily an evil thing. And I think growth in ultra running is inevitable. And you probably know that the vast majority of growth that we have now in ultra running is coming from road racers. And they have certain expectations. Road racers are not troubled by the fact that the guys who win their races may get some money, They're not troubled by the fact that you've got sponsors who may not be directly involved in the running world. And on the other hand, there's things about our sport that are very special and that are very unique. I mean, you've got people doing, running through mountains in extraordinary places with great scenery. And it in a lot of ways, it's a solitary sport. And there's a lot of people who are attracted to that side of it as well, the trail running. Those things are not, we have to get out of the notion that those are contrary goals. And I think that's what we've tried to do. I don't know if we're successful. You'd have to ask some of our people who've run our race. But we've tried to capture both of them. We've tried to say, all the good things that, people liked about ultra running back 40 years ago when, there'd be, 100 people running the race and that'd be it. The family spirit can coexist with the professional side of it. And people have to get out of the notion that those things are contradictory.
That's an interesting statement. So I just had Caleb Efta on the podcast, who is the race director for the High Lonesome 100 in the Saguache range. And I think one of his, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but if I remember correctly, one of his beliefs is those two scenarios sort of are mutually exclusive, where he's very concerned that races that are taking on an increasingly commercial tone are a threat to sort of the mom and pop indie style races of our sport. And I'm curious if it sounds like it's not a concern of yours. So I'd love to hear you talk about that more.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but I'm not sure. I didn't hear his thing, so I'm not sure why he's saying that. And I think we've shown that at least in our, I think we've shown it's just not true. I'm not sure what he means by, or what you mean by commercialization. I mean,
this is all under the umbrella of like UTMB buying up races and having their World Series format and requiring runners to participate in UTMB races to get to Chamonix. And I think, among other reasons, he's concerned that that world being created is going to negatively affect smaller races and races that aren't affiliated with that process. I think we have a big tent. And there are people who are going to want to go and run UTMB or its races. There are people who want to go to Chamonix and watch 10,000 people get on the trail, and they don't mind, or they enjoy like being in a conga line of runners. I mean, there's a lot of camaraderie for that. And there are some people who like that. But there's a lot of people who don't. And those people will not participate in UTMB or Ironman, I guess is really what it is, right? They will not participate in those events. They'll participate in others. But the sport is growing, and there's ample room for all kinds of ideas and different kinds of races. And I don't see, I think, I get the view of UTMB as this, but I think the big bad wolf.
But I think in a large measure it's a MacGuffin. It's again, most people don't care about UTMB. If they do, they want to go run it once, as maybe they should. I mean, for most people, it is who are interested. It's a bucket list race. I think it's a MacGuffin. I really do.
I'm just looking here at my notes. Are there any, this is a fun question. Are there any, do you have a couple more minutes, by the way? Are you okay to, okay. Have you come across any other quote unquote blueprints on the internet about our sport? Like, you've written this awesome blueprint about sponsorship and the growth of our sport. Are there any other pieces of content you've come across on the internet that you think would be great conversation starters?
Honestly, no. And that blueprint, which I sent you, I mean, I haven't looked at. It needs more work, obviously. It was really just a draft that I used to hand to us, that I used to give to our sponsors to try to encourage them, think big picture here. Don't just think about like coming to our race and making sure there are banners at the finish line and making sure that we promote you on our website and on our Facebook posts, which we will do, but start thinking bigger pictures. Talk to the other sponsors of our race. Talk to people who are invested in the ultra world and the running world who aren't part of our race, and let's get together and really do what we can to promote the sport, because it's going to help you more than we can. Look, we have 500 runners in the race. How many shoes can we sell? There's only so many shoes that we can sell. There's only so many headlamps and socks, right, that can be sold.
What did they say when you approached them with it? Did any of them latch on?
They said what you said. This thing is really great. And that's it. That's it.
Well, Fred, it's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you. I think I'm quickly learning. It was probably obvious for a while, but at least personally, I'm quickly learning that races are this awesome melting pot for assimilation into our sport. And for the context of this podcast, a great water cooler for conversational topics. I think that what you have written is a great instigator for important conversation in the sport. We will make sure to link to it in the show notes, as well as all of the details around the Run Rabbit Run race, which happens in mid-September out in Steamboat Springs every year. This has been a pleasure. Is there anything else that we should cover before we go?
No,
I could talk all day.
Yeah, I could talk all day. You're the host. If there's anything else that you'd like me to opine on, I'm a lawyer. I have opinions about a lot of things. And, they say about lawyers, we have now an inch deep and an acre wide, right? I mean, but no, it's been great talking to you and meeting you.
Right on. Awesome. Actually, you know what? One more topic. I promised the last topic. Live coverage in the sport. So
live coverage in the sport.
Curious to get your thoughts on what has been created to date, if that has either put a dent in this problem we've talked about today, or it could, and then B, would Run Rabbit Run ever want to do something like that?
Well, and I think the live coverage issue is not something that it's not only ultra running that is struggling with it. And there's always going to be a handful of people who are going to want to. I mean, I used to get up in the middle of the night and see how runners are doing in Western states. But let's face it, the number of people who are going to do that is going to be pretty small. Watching live video of people crossing aid station or finish lines is only slightly better than watching paint dry. There are ways, again, back to the Leadville thing, there are ways of marketing our sport and making it riveting. Look, even in professional poker, trust me, they're not showing every single hand that people are playing, because these people play for hours and hours, and most of them do absolutely nothing. They're showing the big hands. They're showing the big moves that are being made. And that's kind of what we have to do initially. One of the things specific about Run Rabbit Run, and again, I don't want to devote too much about our
please.
But, we have real issues with just getting access. It's a remote course. A lot of places there's no satellite coverage, let alone cell phone coverage, and so it's difficult. It's difficult to follow it. The only way we can do it really and have live coverage is to have dedicated people who want to do the timing, and then they need to, leave their aid stations and go somewhere where they can get cell phone or satellite coverage. It's not easy, and I think everybody's going to struggle with that.
Well, we talked
bicycling. I mean, you
yeah.
watch the Tour de France. I mean, and that's only a 5 or 6 hour, stage. Most of it's pretty, until the climbs and the ending. It's kind of dull. It's not for everyone.
We were talking offline before we hit record about the proverbial smoke-filled rooms in our sport, and it makes me think, because one of the big takeaways I have from this conversation, and I could be wrong, but it seems like our sport needs a single point of leverage, this massive break, whether it's getting into the Olympics or doing what the World Series of Poker did on ESPN or having one of these Netflix series. And it makes me wonder, maybe you have an idea here, who do we need to recruit from within our sport to sort of coordinate this opportunity with the powers that be at all of these major media outlets? Like, what is the title of that person in our sport? And what is the title of that person over at ESPN or Netflix? How do we get them in the same room? And how do we pitch this? Because I think that part of it is not just like, the accretion of marginal gains. It's also these like one big break moments.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's what UTMB is trying to do, is they're trying to make themselves the world championship of ultra running. The problem that they're going to have is that Americans simply aren't interested in following European racing. I mean, it's just not happening. And so that presents an opportunity. But you're right. There has to be some kind of a focal thing. Now, the way the media works right now is you need to, essentially, they're infomercials. You're buying time on Netflix or on cable, and you're getting sponsors to pay for that, for the creation of the content, and then you put it on cable or Netflix or satellite or whatever. Again, the answer to all the questions is money, right? You need to have the money to put together a Jim McKay Wide World of Sports level product, and you need to have a group of people, race directors, runners, sponsors, who are willing to take the risk and say, we can do this and do it.
I don't know. You may know the answer to this question, but I've always wondered, do we have somebody with Phil Knight level wealth in our sport that also just is a super fan and loves the sport and can be like, hey, I'll go fund $200 million. That's a drop in the bucket. I'll go Phil.
I hope he's listening if there is. I don't know of any, but you're right. It's somebody who has who has the money to say, you know what, I love this sport. Hey, I may make money down the road on it. Let me do what I can. But
we need a market maker.
Don't you know somebody? This is what you're far more tuned into the sport than I am. I mean, but you're right. You need to have either a one big race, love for it to be Run Rabbit Run, maybe Western States, maybe both. Have a series of things you're putting on Netflix or cable, and that's my that's Siri for some reason.
Siri.
But anyway, and have patience and watch the races as they develop, and so that people can start saying, "Hey, I remember this. I remember this guy from the last race." Like those. What are those? What's that sport that people where they climb the ropes and they jump? They go through the hoops.
Oh, like American Warrior or whatever that show is called on NBC.
Exactly. Yeah. Something like that. Except our sport is so much better than those American Warrior, Ninja Warrior or whatever they're called. But that's what we need, somebody who's willing to invest in it. If people are watching Ninja Warrior on TV by the millions, or the Tough Mudder races by the millions, how can, if you feel about our sport the way I do, how can we fail if we promote it properly?
And I feel like we just got to create a bunch of montages, because I feel like there's this concern in our sport that we need to sell the entire start to finish of the event.
Right.
And it's really just a matter of clips. and patching them together in a meaningful way. And because every other sport does that, Hard Knocks does that, at Last Chance University on Netflix for football and basketball does that. It's montages. We just got to create montages.
Well, look what's happened, for example, in Formula One racing. What is it called? The Drive to Survive?
Yep, and there's one for tennis now too.
Yeah, right. They are making these documentaries where they're focusing on the individuals, making you know these people and care about these people, at the same time as they're showing the competitiveness of these events. Trust me, they are not showing all 3 hours of these guys running around in circles, but they're showing enough of it that you can see the dramatic moments. That's what we should be doing. Not putting a camera at the finish line and watching guys, wave as they cross the finish line.
Last question, I promise.
This
has been awesome. You said earlier that you're pretty convinced Americans are not interested in following the European scene. And I'm curious why you think that, because it's pretty well documented that, the NBA, for example, or the NFL are these worldwide phenomenons, and Europeans, vice versa, they tune into these American leagues with great enthusiasm. So what's missing in the European product that would make Americans not want to tune out or tune in?
I don't know if there's anything missing in the European product. I think that the fact that American runners and ultra runners and trail runners are not following European running is just symptomatic of the fact they're not following our running at all. Gotcha. Maybe it'll change, but I guess my point is it presents a tremendous opportunity for Americans to promote their sport, because right now nobody's following it at all. And I don't know whether we were offline or I mentioned this before, but I guess if you asked, 50 ultra runners in the U.S. who finished third in UTMB last year, I don't think anybody would have a clue. If it wasn't for Killian and Courtney and maybe Katie Scheid, because they're Americans, they wouldn't have a clue. So again, it presents an opportunity for us. And maybe UTMB will be successful in promoting their sport to Americans. I don't think so, because I don't think that the way they promote their sport, I think the way they're promoting their sport works in Europe. But Americans are pretty parochial. They don't look at things the same way.
Well, this has been awesome, Fred. A lot of great questions for the audience to dwell on. I, of course, deeply appreciate your perspective. To reiterate, the blueprint is awesome. And if I could issue one call to action for the listeners, in addition to reaching out to you, if you'll allow to continue the conversation, I hope that there are more manifestos created in our sport. I want to see the ultra running equivalent of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations or Karl Marx's Das Kapital. I want to see these free-flowing ideas about the future flow. So thank you for even though this happened, back in 2018, so we're kind of delayed here. Let's kickstart it. Let's make, the 2020s the era of these manifestos and blueprints. How about it?
I'm with you. And if nothing else, I'd love for people to read my blueprint and tell me how wrong I am and how they've got better ideas, because I am, run, rabbit, run. Hang on a second. Run, rabbit, run. I'm all ears.
For those that are not viewing on YouTube, Fred brought out the famous ears from Run, Rabbit, Run.
Thank you so much.